I have people ask me sometimes, as a Christian, should I get divorced? It's a good question. I've covered divorce before in some of the other videos I've done, but this one is very specific on divorce. Um, and it starts out, if you go back to Deuteronomy 4:2, it Moses was very clear that the commands he gave, the commands, judgments, and statutes were from God. And if you read everything else that Jesus said, Paul said, anything with that in mind, it creates a either divinely inspired and errant type thing, or you know, they're conflicting, right? So a few verses like in Deuteronomy 4:2, it says, "You shall not add." I'm going to paraphrase this, but I'm going to quote the verses. "You shall not add, neither shall you diminish that which uh, that ye may keep the commandments of the Lord your God, which I command you." Don't add or take away from what Moses said. And then 4:5 in Deuteronomy, Moses is saying he taught statutes and judgments, even as the Lord, all caps, my God commanded me. And then in 4:45 he says, "These are the testimonies and the statutes and the judgments which Moses spake unto the children of Israel." Pretty explicit. Moses is claiming he got this stuff from God. And Moses says that in Deuteronomy 24:1, he says, if you marry somebody, you find no fish. Just you don't like her, he says, give her a bill of divorcement, send her away, and she can go to be another man's wife. Now remember, the statutes, the laws, the judgments, these are all supposed to be from God. And it says she can go to be another man's wife. Deuteronomy 24:3, it says, if the latter husband don't like her, gives her a bill of divorcement. Next verse, her former husband would send her away, can't take her back again. So this is supposedly, Moses is claiming divine, he gets it straight from God. In Matthew, Jesus says, you've heard it of old time, you shall not commit adultery. So before I get into that, Moses, getting his stuff from God, said it was okay to divorce your wife. Moses said, according to God, it was okay for another man to marry your wife that you divorced. It was okay. Moses says, according to God, that adultery is having sex with another man's betrothed or married wife. That's what Moses says God told him. Jesus comes along and says, you've heard of old time, don't commit adultery. He says, but I say unto you, whosoever even looks on a woman, paraphrasing, to lust after her has committed adultery in his heart already. So Jesus is creating a sin where there was no sin. And then, Jesus basically, he added to the law. He changed it, or took away, however you want to look at it. And even if true, looking at a single woman wouldn't be defined as adultery. If you have sex with a single woman, that's not adultery. So if you lusted after a single woman in your heart, how would that be adultery? It's not adultery by definition of the literal way of what adultery is. So you can't commit adultery with a single woman. Therefore, lusting after a single woman cannot be adultery. I hear women all the time say, "Oh, you lusted after you're no." So Matthew 5:31, it's Jesus says, "It has been said, whoever shall put away his wife, give her a bill of divorcement." Moses commanded this, according to and he said he got his stuff from God. Moses also said, "Don't add or take away." Jesus, don't add or take away. But this is exactly what Jesus does. Jesus says, "But I say unto you, whoever puts away his wife, saving for the cause of fornication, causes her to commit adultery. And whosoever shall marry her that is divorced committeth adultery." So this kind of coincides with the law. A man could put away his wife. A woman had no authority to divorce her husband. So in this verse, the husband isn't committing adultery, but the wife is. and the man that marrying her is also. That's just contrary to what Moses said, that God said they could and should do. Matthew 19, it's kind of a reiteration. He says unto them, Moses, because of the hardness of your heart, suffered you to put away your wives. But from the beginning it was not so. So Moses claimed that, again, he got the statutes, the laws, and the judgments from God. That's what Moses claims. Jesus is claiming Moses allowed them to divorce and commit adultery, by the way. Now, if you follow it through, Jesus is saying that Moses allowed them to sin because of the hardness of their heart. So he could give them all these other laws, the no-nos, don't do this, don't do this. But he had to concede this one because of the hardness of their hearts. It just doesn't make sense. Furthermore, it is changing the law. Moses said he got all this stuff from God. Jesus is saying, well, Moses suffered you to do it, but it wasn't so from the beginning. Well, the law is supposed to be pure, spiritual, holy, just, good, but it allows you to do something that's sin. Jesus comes along and says, yeah, well, he allowed you to do that, but it really was sin. So this pure, holy, good, just, godly, righteous law allows you to sin. Think about that. That's what he's saying, because that's what the rest of the whole book says that the law is. Mark. Oh, Mark. Moses suffered, Mark 10, well, chapter 10. Moses suffered to write a bill of divorcement to put her away. And Jesus says, because of the hardness of your heart, he wrote this. And he calls it a precept. It's not a law, statute, or judgment. It's a precept. And they said, whosoever shall put his way, he says, whoever puts away his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. Like, what? What? That's not what Matthew said. If all you had was the book of Matthew, and all somebody else had was the book of Mark, you guys would be arguing right now. You'd have a split, and you go create your own denominations. You would. That's what happens today. That's why we have all these different denominations, because people look at different things written in the book that literally conflict with each other, and some people take one side and some people take the other, and they fight and argue and blah blah blah. That's the way it is. So Jesus said, if you put away your wife and you marry somebody else, you commit adultery against her. It's now how the law defines adultery. And then it says, if a woman put away her husband and be married to another, she commits adultery. Well, what about the guy who marries the wife? Or the man who marries the woman after the divorce? Are they committing adultery? It doesn't say. This implies that the person doing the divorcing is the one committing adultery. If that's all you have, that's what you got to go by. It's wrong. All right, it's wrong. These Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John conflict. One of them is wrong. They can't all be right. And it disagrees with Moses. Moses says, don't add, don't take away. All these things I'm telling you, they came from God. Jesus comes along and says, hey, I say unto you. So you got to ask, if you're still a Christian, if you still believe in Jesus, and believe in Jesus, and you believe in God, and you think you consider yourself a Christian, you have to ask yourself, is the Gospels divinely inspired, or are they just the Gospels according to, written, in some cases, decades after the fact? And they're wrong. They misquoted Jesus, like Jesus didn't say that. And the other thing too is, back in this day, women could not, biblically, under the law, Jewish law, a woman couldn't. They didn't have any rights. And even in modern times with Jesus, they didn't have any rights. The Romans later later, and this is where the books being written at a later time come into play, is, 100 something years later, the Romans, women had more rights, but not when Jesus was around. So it just shows the worldly influence on what Jesus supposedly said. So you go to Luke, and it says something different again. Whoever puts away his wife and marries another commits adultery, and whosoever marry her that put away from her husband commits adultery. So does the wife commit adultery? Luke doesn't say she does. She's the victim. So why I'm saying all this is to say is, if you're going to be a good Christian and you don't want a divorce and all this stuff, if you read just the stuff from Jesus, ignore the law that says you can divorce your wife. And so ignore that, right? And you just go by what Jesus says. One place says you can divorce your wife except for, you can't divorce your wife unless it's for fornication, which then you got to define fornication. Mark comes along and, says that a man or a woman can divorce. But if you do, and you go marry somebody else, the divorcer is the one committing adultery. So the victim, according to Mark, is off the hook. And then Luke, you put away your wife, you marry another, you commit adultery. And, it's just, take your pick. And then the other thing with Luke is it's very odd that this verse, Luke 6:18, if you're reading down through, it's thrown in there. It's totally unrelated to everything above it, below it. It's just like, where did that come from? Which tells you that So Romans, Paul actually gives, must have been a running theme at that day and age. Romans 7, it says that a woman is bound. A woman that has a husband is bound by law to her husband as long as he lives. But if he's dead, she can marry somebody else. So, if while her husband lives, she be married to another, she shall be called an adulteress. Now you notice Paul doesn't say that if a man marries another woman, that he's an adulterer. Doesn't say that. But he does follow the theme that Jesus had in Matthew, that the woman, if a man divorces a woman, he's forcing her to be an adulteress. Paul's teaching is similar to that, where he's agreeing that if a woman's married to another man, she's an adulteress. Now, 1 Corinthians 7:1-2, Paul says it's good for a man not to touch a woman. That's his. He didn't say that's his opinion. He just says it's good for a man not to touch a woman. He goes, nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband. Fornication is defined in Leviticus 18, and then it's repeated in 20 with the consequences. These are the do's and don'ts of sex. These are what fornication is. In 7:10, it says, 1 Corinthians, he says, unto the married I command, but not the Lord. Let not the wife depart from her husband. So, yet not I, but the Lord. So, in verse 7, in chapter 7, verse 10 of 1 Corinthians, Paul is saying that God himself is commanding, let not the wife depart from her husband. But if she depart, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. Let not the husband put away the wife. This again is reinforcing what was common back then. Women didn't have the ability to divorce a man. They didn't. And when you read this, it makes it very clear that a wife couldn't divorce her husband, but she could leave him. So this is the command. It's the command of God himself. And he's saying, hey, don't divorce your wife, and don't divorce your wife. And yeah, so we see the agreement of Matthew's Gospels with what Jesus said, that they disagree with Moses with the whole divorce thing. Like, hey, don't divorce, it's a sin. Paul is saying the same thing. Hey, don't divorce. He didn't say it's a sin, but he says don't divorce. Paul also reinforces that if the woman does marry somebody else while her first husband is alive, she's an adulteress. But then Paul goes on to say that if you have an unbelieving spouse and they choose to leave, then you can go do what you want. Take your pick.